Hello, everyone. This is Hutton Jackson. Today, I'm joined by Christian Sweney, former writer with the Washington Post, now with Inside Lacrosse. Today, we're going to talk about his new book, We Showed Baltimore, a book about the rise of Cornell Lacrosse under head coach Richie Moran. Christian, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely, Hutton. Thank you for asking.
Of course. And I want to start, before we get into the book, when did you first get involved in lacrosse? Kind of what's your lacrosse background?
Born and raised in Washington, D.C., lacrosse wasn't huge when I was growing up. And I actually got into it when my smarter older brother was accepted to Johns Hopkins. And his freshman year of 1989, the first game he saw was the Hopkins-Syracuse regular season game, Petramala and Quinkesenik against the Gate brothers. And Hopkins won by a goal. And of course, they met again in the title game in '89 that Syracuse won by a goal. But he was hooked right away. And of course, he's the older brother. He got me into Howard Stern, Led Zeppelin, and lacrosse. So he gets credit for all those things.
I love that. And, you've been working on this book for a while. What kind of gave you the idea, though, to dive into this era of lacrosse? And how long have you actually been working on this book?
The book took almost 5 years, Hutton, from the first idea of it to its, finished product right there. And there were a couple things, and I have to give Cornell Press a lot of credit, my editor Michael McGandy, because first it was sort of Cornell used to be really good, they haven't won a title since '77, kind of what happened, what made them so good then, and they've always been consistently solid, but have not won a title since 1977, since Damon McEnany's senior year. So that was part of it. But the '70s era was also the first NCAA tournament. It was also the switch from wooden sticks to plastic sticks. It was also the rise of Long Island high school lacrosse. And all these sort of ripple effects, Cornell Press said, no, go. If you find something, follow that thread. In my time at the Washington Post and Inside Lacrosse really taught me to follow threads, and they didn't always lead somewhere, but they usually did. And so that was kind of what it was, what made Cornell good then, and then sort of just looking at the period in general and not just Cornell.
And I think I read somewhere that you did like 90 interviews for this book. Who are some of your favorite people to talk to and kind of provided the most detail for this book?
One of the things that surprised me, it was at least 90 or so people, and sometimes they were kind enough to let me interview them 3 and 4 and even 5 times. One of the things that really impressed me was how much these guys remembered, and not just the Cornell guys who obviously had some success in the '70s, the Johns Hopkins players, even Greg Murphy from Navy, the 1970 Defenseman of the Year, still remembered a lot about his time at the North-South game in Lexington, Virginia, June 13th, 1970. Dan McAsee, the goalie on the '76 and '77 title teams at Cornell, who, when he was a starter at Cornell, they went 29-0. He didn't lose a game as a starter. It's incredible. But he said, before we do this interview, he's a very high power lawyer now in DC. He said, well, let me turn on some Peter Frampton, because that's what we used to listen to in the locker room every day. Peter Frampton Comes Alive, and he said that. But he went game by game without my prompting. I had their schedule in front of me, and they said, well, and then we played Rutgers, and they had a 6'7" crease attackman who always gave me trouble. And, I looked it up, and this guy had scored 4 goals against Cornell that day. What really impressed me was how much these guys remembered and how important competition, not just victory, because again, I talked to a lot of people who lost, and even the Cornell guys on the '78 team that did not win the title were very frank about why they lost, and that they had become a little bit overconfident, and just their memories and how much competition meant to them, how much their teammates and Coach Moran meant to them was what really stuck with me.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the aspects of this book that's interesting too, that many people maybe not realize, is that one of the best things that come, in college lacrosse is the tournament every May, but that actually wasn't established until 1971. And you kind of highlight, the establishment of this tournament. There's actually a little bit of pushback. So speak on the eventual implementation of the NCAA tournament in lacrosse and kind of why there was some pushback to it initially.
Yeah, sure. Up till 1970, it was almost like the way that college football used to award its national champions. It would be a vote, and in college football, I think it was mostly journalists who would vote. And in lacrosse, it was coaches and administrators who would vote on the national champion. There was no postseason at all. And, in 1971, the NCAA said, well, let's decide it on the field, and there had been some pushback back and forth, and some people in Baltimore in favor, some people were not. But certainly programs like Cornell, which had gone undefeated in 1966, undefeated again in 1968, and undefeated again in 1970, had not been voted a share of a national championship. They felt very hard done by, and other programs would have as well. And part of the Cornell's other problem is that they weren't playing those so-called Big 5 teams, Army, Navy, Johns Hopkins, Maryland, and Virginia Cornell couldn't even get them on the schedule. And so once the NCAA tournament came around, then all of a sudden everything became much more of a meritocracy, and it was decided on the field. And even for Cornell, the first title in 71 that they won, by 73, Navy was on their schedule. By 74, Johns Hopkins was on their schedule. They were able to scrimmage Maryland. And so it really did help open up the sport to just beyond those Big Five teams.
No, that's awesome. And Richie Moran became Cornell's head coach in 1969. He went on to lead the Big Red for 29 seasons, winning 3 of those national championships, including that 1971. What contributed, do you think, to Richie's success? I know that's probably a big question for a short answer, but what do you think contributed to Richie's success, particularly against many of these sports powerhouses, like you mentioned, Maryland, Navy, Hopkins? How did he get this team to play at such a high level and eventually win those 3 in the 70s?
The biggest thing he did, Hutton, he recruited, and he was from Long Island, and he was smart enough to realize that Long Island high school lacrosse was much better than the Big Five would have given it credit for. Mm-hmm. So he, in 1970, within a 5-mile radius of Hofstra University on Long Island, there were 5,000 boys playing high school lacrosse. And in Baltimore, there was probably a fifth of that, at most 1,000. So a lot of the Big Five schools were really focused on the Baltimore private school, high schools. And Moran basically had that 5,000 people on Long Island to himself. And so he could recruit, the best Long Island players. He could recruit athletes. He would get a few players from Baltimore, but not that many, So he was smart enough to realize that Long Island high school lacrosse was very good. So he was smart enough to get those players, show an interest in them. And other than that, he wasn't the huge X's and O's guy, but he was smart enough to hire Mike Waldvogel as an assistant. And Waldvogel was an X's and O's. It was very analytical and a little bit different. And the biggest thing about Richie was that he was a motivator. One of the guys, Dave Bray, said it every single time out, the team would come in the huddle, and Moran would, you're doing this terrible. You have to do this better. This isn't good enough. But he would always leave them on a positive. Then he would build them up, say, look, I know you're better than this. You showed it to me in practice last week. You showed it last week in that game. You've worked so hard in your preseason conditioning. No one has worked harder than you. You go out there and get this next goal, take the game over again the way you had last week or last month. And so all those things, I think, really made him a very good motivational coach. And he had hardworking kids who wanted to win. And I think he was able to pass that chip on his shoulder onto them.
Now, you mentioned the stick technology's evolution a little bit earlier. Let's talk about that. Tell me a little bit about how going from wooden sticks to plastic sticks impacted this era of lacrosse.
The wooden sticks, I have one right here behind me. I mean, they were beautiful. Awesome. They were handcrafted. Maybe a little bit expensive, but for what they were, and they were such a tradition to the sport unto itself. The Native Americans who used it, they wanted a wood stick, and they wanted leather and catgut and a leather ball because these were all natural. They were not synthetic, and these all came from God. And to them, lacrosse was the creator's game, and they wanted to honor their creator by using things that he had created. And so that for the Native Americans in the history of the sport, a synthetic webbing on a plastic stick head, synthetic webbing, a rubber ball would have been somewhat anathema to them. But I liken it to, if you really love something, you try to improve it. And there's no question that the game was improved by the plastic sticks because they made passing more accurate, they made shooting more accurate, they made it added more velocity to the shots. And so the people weren't necessarily trying to denigrate the Native Americans. They were trying to improve the sport and make it more accessible. That was the other problem, was the wooden sticks were very hard to find. And with the plastic sticks, you could, as even Roy Simmons said, the head coach at Syracuse for a long time, Roy Simmons said, with the plastic sticks, the kid could walk into a sporting goods store, buy a stick, and be playing that afternoon. That wasn't possible with a wooden stick. You have to break it in almost like a baseball glove, linseed oil and break it in. So you couldn't play with it right away. And if it broke, then you had to break another one in. It took several weeks. Whereas the plastic stick, you could bring 5 of them to a game, and if one broke, you had four more that were exactly the same. So it really made the game much more accessible at a time when the game needed to be more accessible, because Long Island started playing, because the NCAA tournament, raised the expectations of more than just those 5 programs. There were a lot more high schools becoming involved. I mean, the number of high school programs from 1970 to 1978, I think, almost tripled. And so there's no way that the wooden sticks would have been able to meet that demand. And I don't think there's any way that the kids would have been as interested in trying to learn, breaking in a wooden stick.
No, that's awesome. Fascinating stuff. And what do you kind of hope that readers take away from reading your book?
One of the big things, I'm getting a little bit of pushback from people in Baltimore. So, well, we showed Baltimore. So, well, I'm trying to sort of give Baltimore its due, because those teams, the Big Five, were very good. And I don't hide that. in the book, and this isn't a sort of us versus them. In fact, the book ends in 1978 with Johns Hopkins winning the NCAA title. The entire last chapter is on Hopkins winning. And so I don't, I'm not trying to sort of stick it in Baltimore's eyes, so to speak. I'm just trying to say what the decade of the 1970s was. And yes, Cornell was very good. How did they become good? How did the Baltimore establishment, for lack of a better term, react? And ultimately, Baltimore wins. Literally Baltimore wins in the end. Johns Hopkins wins the chapter. The final chapter of the book is Johns Hopkins winning the 78 title. So what I hope people take away, I hope there isn't any defensiveness like, well, I'm from Baltimore or I went to Hopkins, I don't want to read this. Like, I hope that that's not an issue for people. I'm just trying to tell the story of the 70s and sort of how the sport changed forever and why it changed forever and how Richie Moran was able to do it.
No, I think that's awesome. And I think it's going to be a great read for anybody, any lacrosse fan. Remind people where they can find the book.
Yeah, thank you, Hutton. It is available on Cornell University Press. And if you go to my Twitter feed at Sweezy Lacrosse, there is a coupon for 30% off. It is also available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the time, Christian. Thank you for sharing so many details about your new book, We Showed Baltimore. And I hope everyone checks it out.
Thank you so much, Hutton. Thank you for having me.